Hello, everybody. It's Michael Hollands once again for Sound of the Movies. Today I have the pleasure to once again be joined by Nathan Barr. On this episode, we will focus on Carnival Row, The Turning, and also The Hunt, one of his most recent projects. Welcome back, Nathan.
Thank you. Happy to be back.
It's great to have you back, and thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule. And Nathan, which type of music would you consider to be the closest to your own personality today? Either a musical genre or in terms of instrumentation, both organic or synthetic?
And this is by another composer or myself.
Yourself.
Okay. Let's see. I'm writing. I'm composing the score for a show at Hulu right now called The Great, which is about Catherine the Great. It's written by Tony McNamara, who wrote The Favorite a couple years ago. And that music is extremely exciting for me, and I've really enjoyed writing it. It's orchestral, so we're recording orchestra every week. It definitely tips its hat to the Baroque era, but there's a sort of a silliness and a fun contemporary element to it that feels like it covers all the bases as far as who I am as a composer right now, and kind of the exploring as a musician and a composer I'm most enjoying. So that'll come out May 15th on Hulu. And it's just a really wonderful show, and I'm really proud of the score. It's a good project to talk about in the context of the question you asked, because I was just, as I've been working on it, and it's the one I'm currently working on. I have felt exactly as you asked, that this is the one that sort of best I identify with as a composer today.
Right. It's set in the 17th century, correct?
Yes, 17th, 18th century, and it's very humorous and irreverent and a bit naughty, and it's just an extraordinary show. It's one of the better shows I've been involved with. I think people are going to really lose their minds over it. It's so funny and so thoughtfully produced, directed, written, acted.
Sounds looks very promising. And of course, you are known, let's say, for also orchestral writing, but you also explore certain sounds. And I bet this show offered you the chance to fully explore the music of that era and, let's say, kind of full orchestral writing, I reckon.
Yes, yeah, there's a lot of full orchestral writing, a lot of solo flute, solo violin, bassoon, a lot of harp. Some of my Wurlitzer organ is in there. And then there are a number of synth elements too, which bring sort of a slightly contemporary touch to the music in certain places. Yeah, it's been a really fun one to work on.
Nathan, did you use any custom built instruments on one of your latest projects?
Absolutely. So the turning and the hunt, although a little bit less so on the hunt, but the turning especially, I relied on an instrument called a high pressure stautophone. It's an instrument I built and invented with a friend of mine who's in the pipe organ business, and it's basically a gutted reed organ, an antique reed organ. We took all the bits out that were inside and put it's a little technical, but a pipe organ chest into the unit so that I can swap out all sorts of pipes and make all sorts of different sounds with different pipes by physically manipulating them. And then we created a lot of patches and samples based on that instrument, and that is definitely one of the driving sonic forces behind the entire score for the turning.
Also, speaking of the organ, the last time we talked, I remember you mentioning that you wanted to remodel your studio because you also have this gigantic organ. Please tell me about your new studio setup.
Yeah, so I've been in here let's see, just almost 2 years. This May, June will be 2 years in the studio. And yeah, the entire studio is built around this pipe organ that has a really cool place in Hollywood film music history. It was built for Fox Studios in 1928. It's the organ you hear in movies like The Sound of Music, Patton, Witches of Eastwick. So yeah, I sort of became obsessed with the purchase, restoration, and building a new home for this instrument. And so yeah, it's a 9,000 square foot building, and the actual physical components of the pipe organ occupy 6 different rooms. And then the organ speaks into a scoring stage, which can accommodate up to 50 players. And it's a really special place to work every day. And the room really sounds spectacular. It's a very beautiful sounding room, whether it's harp, cello, organ, or full orchestra. It's got a special, unique sound to it.
Great. Must have taken quite the effort to set the studio up, right?
Yeah, it was the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. Imagining it and then designing it and then making sure it actually gets built properly was, yeah, definitely the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. But I'm happy to say it turned out to be a beautiful studio, not only aesthetically but most importantly sonically. It really does sound special, and that was the ultimate goal.
Nathan, speaking of music, I would love to ask you the question, what exactly does musical versatility mean to you personally? What is your definition of being a musically versatile artist?
Yeah, I mean, I think I could speak to that on 2 counts. One is, what does it mean to be versatile as a musician, an instrumentalist, and then what does it mean to be versatile as a composer? As an instrumentalist, I think to be versatile not only means that one might play multiple instruments, it also means that one might be able to play in different styles. And I think the more disparate the styles, maybe the more versatile one is. So I play a lot of plucked stringed instruments, and then I play a lot of bowed string instruments, and some wind instruments. And so I think just like you can play everything from classical to blues to rock and roll on a guitar, cello, I can play, classical rock and roll blues as well. So I think as a musician and instrumentalist, to me it means just having some basic level of facility in many different styles and instruments. And then as a composer, it's kind of the same thing. Like I am really excited to be at the height of my versatility as a composer in terms of the projects that I'm being attracted to. So I'm doing, let's see, a period piece, like I just mentioned, called The Great, which takes place in 18th century Europe. I am doing. I just finished a period piece, a film called Uncle Frank, which takes place in the 70s in the New York and the South, which has a completely different set of sounds and requirements as far as being a composer and an instrumentalist. I just did a short show that takes place in the 40s called Hollywood, which is by Ryan Murphy. That comes on Netflix soon. And that was a very 40s style jazz score.
Great.
And then I'm about to start on a film for Netflix called Kate, which will be something altogether different than that. So I think one of the most exciting things about being a film and television composer is that one hopes to be called upon by many different kinds of filmmakers, telling many different kinds of stories in different genres, and then being able to explore that. And I'm certainly having that experience right now.
And you also get to kind of combine modern elements with a traditional approach, which is also very cool because it kind of keeps you on your toes, and you get to explore many different musical genres. I mean, that's basically, I think, a composer's dream.
It is absolutely, and I think with a show like The Great, they wanted something very off the wall. I think a lot of different composers ended up demoing for it, and they got a lot of traditional sounding stuff, but ultimately felt they wanted something really different. So my first pass, I wrote a demo to get that show. And my first pass at that demo was entirely synthesizer, actually, except for a solo violin. And that was sort of what landed me the show. And then it went from there. So yeah, that kind of show that really pushes the limits and is so beautifully written and created is exactly the thing I'm looking for as a composer these days.
And Nathan, now I would love to talk a bit about Carnival Row, which is still available on Amazon Prime Video for those of you who haven't seen it yet. Could you please tell our audience a bit about the subject matter of this series?
Yes, so Carnival Row is a series created by Travis Beacham. It is a story that takes place in a fantastic world from the past that resembles Victorian England. At least part of the story takes place in something that might look like London from the time of Charles Dickens. It's got a steampunk feel to it, and it's ultimately about centers around two characters. Orlando Bloom plays a detective called Philo, and then there's a fairy woman named Vignette, and so the story centers around their love and separation, and in a world that is increasingly hostile towards minorities, and I don't know. It's kind of it kind of explores a lot of the themes that we're seeing in the world today. Yeah, through this fantastical world that Travis beautifully created.
I mean, if it didn't have this kind of fantasy vibe to it, due to the Victorian setting, it might, or it also kind of reminded me of a Jack the Ripper atmosphere, so to speak, and do the Victorian feeling, the set design, the atmosphere. So it's very cool, and the cinematography, of course, and your score. So several elements really blends together really well. And on top of that, you have the fantasy world. But which characters or storyline were you attracted to first? How did you find the first idea?
I think I was just really one of the more inspiring elements of the show are what you mentioned, which is the cinematography and the set design, and the costumes. Like those were all so beautifully produced and realized, and so there was a lot to think about just looking at it, even before I really understood the story. So that kind of the steampunk nature of all the visuals and the sets kind of informed the steampunk nature of parts of the score, and certainly the main title. So I lean heavily on the Wurlitzer organ throughout this show, both in the score and the main title. Vocals and organ are two sort of really of the central sounds that you hear throughout. And the organ in particular is, it's a very steampunk instrument physically in terms of the way it works and the way it's built into this building here. So I kind of started by writing an early scene in the first episode, one of the very earliest scenes where Philo, I think it's actually the first scene after the opening, where Philo walks down the street, this dingy street on Carnival, called Carnival Row. So I wrote the theme on cello, and then that became the theme that the choir sings in the main title.
The main title sequence is actually very well shot and also beautifully scored. And there are many great main theme variations throughout the series. Also, choir and also violin. And the album features two a cappella versions of one of the themes. Did you have a more choral approach in mind at first? Did you have to fiddle around with that, or did you change direction at some point?
No, I think I just as I wrote cues throughout the scoring the series, vocals seem to lend themselves really well to the themes, and so I actually had one of my assistants, Dimitri Smith, and then my orchestrator, Penka Kuneva, who I've worked with for years, I gave them each a theme to sort of take and arrange into an a cappella vocal arrangement just because I thought it was so beautiful. And that happened before I was done with the season. And as it happened, those cues then became part of larger cues that I reworked in the actual body of the show. So yeah, it was just kind of like a, the human voice is such a such a powerful thing, obviously, when it's done well. And Lisbeth Scott is a famous vocalist and friend of mine, and so she sang a lot of the solo vocal stuff throughout. Had a nine females choir sing a lot of the themes, including those two a cappella tracks on the soundtrack.
And Nathan, I especially loved the violin parts of the series. Please tell me a bit about the musical sensitivities this instrument brings to the table for the characters of this story.
Yeah, so I have three assistants, and my most recent assistant, who started working for me about 2 years ago, is a really brilliant violinist. And so ever since he's come to the studio, I've started writing a lot for violin because it's so wonderful to what I'll do, and what I did in the case of many of these cues in Carnival Row, which feature the violin playing by Harry. What I'll do is I will write a cue, and then he'll come in, and I will either whistle or quickly play onto the piano what I want him to play. And I can literally real time, with him sitting right beside me, hear what it's going to sound like and adjust accordingly to what I want it to be. And then we record it right on the spot. And now, of course, I wouldn't be doing that if the show and the score didn't call for violin. But I think emotionally, there's something really powerful for the love theme of Vignette and Philo in this sound of a solo violin. It's kind of vaguely classical, but not quite classical. And I don't know, there's just something to the timidity of it, yet the virtuosity of it that really speaks to these two characters and their long journey of being together and being apart.
The violin part, which you wrote for Vignette and Philo, is very gorgeous. But another scene comes to mind instantly. One of the best scenes, or let's say one of the best cues on the album, which you wrote for the series, is the love scene between Imogen and Agreus. Could you please tell me a bit about scoring this scene and how you painted it musically?
Yeah, that. So I originally wrote the first part of that cue for a different scene between Philo and another character, which are no longer in the show. And so when it came time to write this scene, I really liked the bones of that cue I had written. So I put it up against a picture here, and I thought, oh, this is actually kind of nice. So I repurposed it for the first part of the cue, and then I kind of out of nowhere pulled that theme out of my hat. When they actually start coming together, that very lyrical melody that's played on the viola and then on the violin in the scene. So yeah, that kind of that was a cue that surprised me, because going in, it was a very last minute thing they threw at me, and it started with a cue written for somewhere else, which then beautifully informed this theme that I know is a beautiful theme that is in the show.
If you had to, or if you were asked to give some pointers and tips to young composers out there, what would it be, or what would your pointer be when it comes to tackling the workload of a series? Would you try to prioritize certain scenes or focus on finding a theme which you can then flesh out later, or character development? What is your suggestion here?
I mean, it really depends on what the filmmakers or TV, the showrunner, is calling for. Fortunately, a lot of the stuff I'm working on right now is very thematic, and so writing themes is hugely important to do as early as possible, so that they find mileage in the series. Like for example, in Hollywood, this show that's coming up on Netflix, I started out early in the process just based on the scripts. I wrote 2 or 3 themes, which then became major parts of the whole show. Ryan Murphy and his fellow filmmakers like Alexis Woodall and the picture editors, they're all very theme driven. So coming up with good themes that worked early on made the work later much easier. Instrumentation wise, it was a 40s show, so it was rooted in a very standard jazz bass, piano, drums, brass. So yeah, I think it really depends. You know, some there are some filmmakers, I haven't really met many of them, who hate themes and hate melody. And
Okay.
they'll say that, you know. And at that point, I think what you want to do is come up with soundscapes and textures as early as possible that work in the world of whatever it is they're scoring.
You know, I tend to believe, and maybe I'm just quote unquote old school, or maybe I just have an affinity for emotion. I mean, I tend to believe that a strong thematic or emotional score, really makes you achieve something that is worthwhile, and the whole product just shines due to the, let's say, thematic content and the emotional force it entails, as opposed to just, writing, just a few thin soundscapes. But also that depends on each given project, but I think you know what I'm getting at.
Yes, yes, totally. I do.
And Nathan, do you feel like you are at your creative best when you're given leeway and freedom, or do you think strict guidelines sometimes help you to fuel creativity? How are you wired personally?
I mean, personally, I need deadlines, and I do some of my best work under deadline. If I have tons of time, I usually wait until pretty close to the deadline to get started because that's when my creative sort of juices start flowing. In terms of strictness around the guidelines, I prefer not to have that. I like a collaborator. I get less inspired by someone who comes in and just tells you what to do, and if you're not doing it, they're telling you you're not doing it. And fortunately, I've had very few collaborations like that. So most of the collaborators I work with, I am happy to say, are like very open to a dialogue back and forth about what's working and what's not working, and hopefully they hire composers because they want the composers to try something different and special and bring a unique sound to the movie or the show. So yeah, I think Alan Ball is a director. I did all 7 seasons of True Blood with him, or at least the seasons he was on. And then we just did this movie Uncle Frank together. And Alan is such a wonderful collaborator because he never speaks musically to the composer. He speaks only emotionally, basically. I mean, he might say, "Oh, I love the cello" or something, but for him, it's really about giving that bit of direction. Like, I want to feel more sadness for this character in this moment, or I want to feel more happiness or joy, and that really leaves a very open field for me as far as how I achieve that, and that's inspiring.
Great. I mean, it's great to find inspiration to really underscore the goings on of a series. Be it something like um, treachery or duplicity, betrayal, and of course, which are also attributes or, let's say, characterizations of Carnival Row. So it offers you the chance to really get the creative juices going, and
Yep.
I think you did very well on Carnival Row, and I think it's
Thank
one.
you.
Yeah, I mean it's a very good show, and I hope I will enjoy season number 2. And of course, I can't wait to hear the score, and let's hope they will resume production quickly. Nathan, at the beginning, we briefly or breezed over, let's say, another project or different project which you had worked on, which is called The Turning. The film feels very bleak and also eerie. Could you tell me a bit about this project and how you kind of tackle the scenes and how you explored the sounds and how it all came to life?
Yeah, so I did a film at Amblin 2 years ago called The House with the Clock in Its Walls, and that was a really great experience for all of us. And so they brought me in to meet Floria Sigismondi, who is the director of The Turning, and she came to my studio and we just talked about music, and I showed her some of my instruments, and she was really excited about the way that I make music, and so I got hired. And yeah, she was Floria is really, brilliant visually. She's just so spectacular the way she thinks about telling a story, and she's very much also a collaborator, and I think really craves that in-person collaboration. And so she spent many days here at my studio while I was working, and it was actually a real pleasure. She's excited to be a part of the process, but whereas once in a while you'll have a director who kind of gets in the way of the process, or is very anxious, and that's maybe not conducive to writing. But she is not that person at all. She's someone who's really respectful and excited to be seeing sort of, oh, well, how's that sound actually made, and what if you do this or that. And so it was a really fun experience for me working with her. And yeah, this was all based around this instrument that my friend and I built and invented called a stoutophone. And again, it's a pipe organ based instrument. But instead of going up and messing with the very carefully calibrated and tuned pipes of the Fox Wurlitzer, this allows me to take sort of old, beaten up, junky pipes that I've collected over the years and make experimental sounds with them without worrying about, where they end up. And so, yeah, that a lot of the whooshing rhythms and haunting droning and sort of almost weeping sounds that are in the film all come from this instrument called the stoutophone. So I had a hunch early on that building something like this would pay off, and it certainly did. And it's also, honestly, it's also very much a driving part. My assistants really wonderfully came up with all sorts of really cool rhythmic, air-driven percussion loops that also drive parts of Carnival Row. So.
In terms of the turning, will there be another album focusing on your score? Because a soundtrack album has been released, but as far as I can tell, there is no full score released yet, right?
Yeah, there isn't, and I unfortunately the movie didn't perform well at the box office, but that may not negate the idea that there could be a score album. So it's certainly something I'm interested in, because I have a couple of composers have reached out about really liking the score too, and so yeah, maybe I need to explore that a bit more than I have.
Horror films, or let's say thrillers, tend to have a certain quote unquote soundscape, and at times I think it can be hard to be creative composition wise, if I may say so. How do you work on these films? How do you avoid certain traps?
Well, I think that this instrument is a perfect example of how I avoid those traps by creating an instrument that's totally unique, that makes pretty unusual sounds. I can achieve dramatically the same thing that those sort of more traditional tired string effects would achieve, but in a very different way. So that's definitely my my preferred choice, is just having having instruments that are different, and then figuring out how to achieve the same thing that traditional means would achieve, but in a very different way.
Nathan, now I would love to talk a little bit about The Hunt, which was released in March, and a score album has also been released. And please tell our audience a bit about the concept of this movie, which was surrounded by a little bit of controversy.
Yeah, yeah. This movie can't catch a break. It was first hurt because, tragically, with all the gun violence in the United States, there were two incidents that happened right in the lead up to the release of this film, and
Okay.
and I think Universal and Blumhouse rightfully thought it would be in poor taste to release the film at that time, And then our our president also tweeted about the film and the hypocrisy of it. Of course, with no context, and he had not seen the film, nor had any of the other people talking about it, so they were way off base in terms of how they were criticizing it. I think there was a feeling at that time that that one side won over the other, and it really is a no holds barred, no one gets out alive with a surprise ending in terms of who I guess who does win. And then of course it gets pushed to a week before coronavirus and the theater's shut. So uh, yeah, I really enjoyed working with the director Craig Zobel. I had 3 weeks to come in and score the whole thing. So it was a very I got a call out of the blue from Universal, and they said we need someone to come in really quickly. 3 weeks, score this whole film. Can you do it? And I said absolutely. So it was just one of those where I hit the ground running, and 3 weeks later had a finished score. And
Wow.
yeah, so Craig Zobel and also Damon Lindelof were two of the people I got to know a bit, and I admire them both, and admire what Damon and Nick Cuse were doing when they wrote it. It's sort of a really, in your face, crazy story, that is intended to, as they've said, incite dialogue from all sides about things, and not come down on one side.
Well, do you think the movie also would have been surrounded by controversy if it hadn't been for those two special circumstances?
Yeah, I think only until people actually saw it. I think ultimately the answer to that question is no. I don't think it would have generated controversy. I think the controversy was based on early trailers, which were not necessarily representative of what the film really is. And I mean, I would think, having seen a film like The Joker come out, which I loved, that to me, given the power of that film, could incite violence much more than a film like The Hunt, which is so it's such a genre, deliberately full of all sorts of tropes from horror films. It's neither worse or better in terms of its portrayal of violence than a million other horror films that we've all seen. So it's I think the sort of tagline, the political nature of the tagline may have generated some controversy, but I think had it come out at that time, minus that gun violence, it would have come out and done what it was supposed to do, which is be a sort of fun, crazy ride, and that's it.
Nathan, is there anything else on your mind you would like to share with me and our audience in terms of your most recent productions or your music in general?
No, I think just to check out Hollywood on Netflix, and then The Great on Hulu, and then Uncle Frank, which will come out on Amazon sometime later this year. Those are three shows, all of which live outside of the horror genre, which I've done a lot of, and I think these are more accurate portrayals of where I'm at as a composer these days than a lot of the straight horror stuff, which I enjoy, but I've done a lot of. So yeah, I think it's a very interesting and crazy time for all of us to be trying to continue with our livings, whatever they are. And creatively, it's fun to see all of the people around the world, whether they're musicians or comedians or whatever, tackling the difficulty of what we're all going through with a sense of humor and with inspiring things. It's really beautiful.
Nathan, I would like to thank you very much for taking so much time out of your busy schedule. I really enjoyed talking to you once more, and I hope you enjoyed the conversation as well.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure as always.